Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the girl who punched through time, Obeka Splitter of Seconds. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee or through my Game Nerds affiliate links in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commander we'll be covering next and which commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Obeka Splitter of Seconds is a 2/5 Ogre Warlock with Menace that costs 1 and Grixis that has the following ability. Whenever she deals combat damage to a player, we get that many additional upkeep steps after that phase. Breaking down her core stats, Obeka is packing a mid-weight CMC, a low-power high-toughness stat block for her cost with built-in pseudo-evasion in the form of Menace to at least force her to be double-blocked, and an ability that enables us to manipulate the flow of our turn to generate us additional value if built around properly. Now, on the face of it, Obeka's ability does stone nothing on its own, as the only thing that it'll generate for us is an additional upkeep, and not the draw and untap that usually comes with our beginning phase. That said, there are a lot of cards that proc their effects on our upkeep, ranging from sources of repeatable value to further our game plan, to more offensive-oriented sources of AoE burn and or AoE drain to instead inflict damage onto our opponents, all of which can take advantage of Obeka granting us, at base, 2 additional upkeep steps to not only proc those effects immediately instead of having to wait a full rotation to do so, but to also get us extra uses out of them instead of being limited to once per rotation. So, seeing as Obeka is incentivizing us to run as many cards with effects that proc on our upkeep to get the most use out of her, this build will be doing just that by running a wide variety of generic on upkeep effects that either generate us more value, help us build up our board state, or directly harm our opponents on both our standard upkeep and on any additional upkeeps Obeka grants us, along with a small suite of cards focused around the monarch and the initiative, the former having a decent suite of payoffs that care about us being the monarch on our upkeep, which Obeka can easily fulfill by stealing the crown as she cracks in and then making it our upkeep immediately to proc those effects, and the latter instead having payoffs that care about us completing dungeons, which again will be able to clear in record time thanks to Obeka grabbing the initiative from our opponents and then letting us venture into 2 extra rooms at least every time she connects, and that's on top of all the value we'll be generating from the undercity itself. Then, in order to further supplement our upkeep-centric game plan, we'll be adding a small suite of ways to grant us additional upkeeps outside of Obeka to get even more usage out of our upkeep-dependent arsenal, and capping things off with ways to empower Obeka so she can hit even harder to generate us even more upkeeps, ways to make her truly evasive so she can reliably get in for damage to net us those upkeeps, and ways to protect her from targeting and removal so she can stick around to enable our upkeep-dependent sources for as long as possible, thereby enabling Obeka to speed up the clock considerably down to our opponent's demise. So let us make our way back to Thunder Junction, back to the Slickshot Gang's hideout, where, alongside Lila, Stella Lee, and the rest of the crew, we'll find their newest member, Obeka. Like so many others on this plane, she traveled here via Omen Path, and, when seeing just how lawless and violent the plane actually was, she instantly became enamored with it. All she had ever wanted was to indulge in all the pleasures life had to offer, and to push her physical and magical strength to their absolute limit in combat, and this place offered both in abundance. And it wasn't long before her trail of debauchery and bodies brought her to the attention of the Slickshot Gang, who procured her services on the spot. Now, running with the most powerful gang on the plane, and with her already potent chronomatic powers augmented even further by their magic amplifying elixirs, Obeka is free to kick back, relax, and break faces to her heart's content. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Kicking things off with a more generic suite of on-upkeep effect creatures that can take advantage of our commander's extra upkeep granting, we'll be running Dragon Master Outcast, whose ability to create an evasive 5/5 on each of our upkeeps gets supercharged alongside our commander to flood the board with an army of huge evasive beatsticks. Twilight Prophet, which lets us draw extra cards and drain the life from our opponents on each upkeep to help replenish our resources and stabilize our life totals while hurting our opponents in the process. Indulgent Tormentor and Bloodgift Demon, both of which generate us even more repeatable card advantage, the former forcing an opponent to lose life or creatures in order to prevent it, and the latter being a targetable Phyrexian Arena that we can point at an opponent if we need some extra reach, with them also being big evasive beatsticks to pile on the damage and or steal back the Monarch and the initiative with. Laughing Jasper Flint, which instead lets us steal resources from our opponent's decks to cast on each upkeep to the tune of 2 cards per upkeep thanks to Obeka being an outlaw, as well as Plarg and Nasiri, which are a bit more random but nonetheless powerful source of value that, essentially, lets us cast the second and third most powerful spells from the top of each player's deck each upkeep at no mana cost. We'll then also be adding Joyra of the Gitu into this category, as she doesn't have an on-upkeep effect herself, but can grant it to other cards in our hand via her Suspend granting, which Obeka can then bring off of Suspend in 2 turns rather than the typical 4 to get those spells online faster and generally at a considerable discount. And finally, as our last generic upkeep-oriented creature, we'll be slotting in Thassa, God of the Sea, whose ability to scry 1 on each of our upkeeps is decent enough as a source of repeatable card selection, but we're primarily running as a repeatable and resilient source of evasion granting to ensure Obeka can get in for damage reliably to generate us those extra upkeeps. Now, moving away from our generic upkeep effects and focusing in on creatures that can both grant us the initiative to generate value from the undercity every upkeep, as well as incentivizing us to hold on to the initiative to augment their effects by completing the dungeon, we have Caves of Chaos Adventurer, which initially serves as a source of repeatable impulse draw as it cracks in, which it can generally do safely thanks to our variety of evasion granting sources, that later turns into free spells off the top of our deck once we've completed the undercity to increase our tempo dramatically. Ravenloft Adventurer, which provides passive graveyard hate as soon as it comes down by exiling our opponent's creatures as they die off, making it an excellent silver bullet against more reanimator focused builds, and, once the dungeon is complete, turns those exiled cards into extra burn as they crack in to pile on the damage. Tomb of Horrors Adventurer, whose ability to let us double up on the second spell we cast each turn, or triple up on that spell instead once the Undercity is cleared, is an excellent way for us to get more copies of our more powerful on-upkeep effects so we can proc them even more often. And lastly, the legend Rilsa Rail Kingpin, whose base effect to grant Death Touch to an attacking creature immediately makes Obeka that much harder to block effectively, as her built-in menace will more or less ensure that she'll be taking down both creatures that block her down with her, and becomes even better once the Undercity is cleared by also tacking on a sizable +5 power boost to that effect as well to net us an extra 5 upkeeps on top of the ones Obeka already generates us to proc our upkeep triggers even more. Then, as an entry that instead cares about making us the Monarch and generating us value for holding on to the crown until our upkeep, we have Skyline Despot, which gives us access to yet another big evasive body that also spawns more big evasive bodies on each upkeep to build up our board even further. So, having covered all our creatures with upkeep-oriented effects of their own, let's switch gears onto creatures that instead focus on netting us extra upkeeps alongside Obeka to get us even more mileage out of all our upkeep triggers, such as the Decepticon Cyclonus the Saboteur, whose front face functions as a repeatable source of evasive card selection that slowly grows him over time with +1/+1 counters as he gets in for damage, eventually converting him into a non-damage source of entire beginning phases consisting of untap, upkeep, and draw steps every other turn, a process we can speed up via our stat boosting sources or potentially proc every turn if combined with our deck sources of Double Strike, Sphinx of the Second Sun, which is yet another source of extra beginning phases, this time providing them passively on our post-combat main phase to net us even more usage out of our upkeep triggers while providing ramp and draw, all on another big evasive body we can use to get in for damage as well, and lastly, the Ninth Doctor, who may only net us an extra upkeep when he untaps, but comes down much earlier than his predecessors, and should have no issue tapping himself down safely by swinging in, considering how many sources of repeatable evasion granting this build has at its disposal. And finally, to wrap up our creature base, we'll be slotting in a source of double strike granting into the build in the form of Lizard Blades, which when reconfigured onto Obeka makes her even harder to block thanks to her now combination of menace and double strike, while also netting us double the amount of additional upkeeps if she's able to connect. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Our instant category is going to consist entirely of removal this time around, focusing on either getting blockers out of Obeka's way if we can't make her truly evasive, or keeping her alive against our opponent's inevitable attempts to remove her, with the former camp consisting of Terminate, which functions as a cheap and efficient source of creature removal with the upside of bypassing regeneration should we encounter it, alongside Bedevil and Chaos Warp, which can hit a wider variety of threats in order to deal with more than just creatures, and the latter camp being comprised of the Counterspell Suite, Arcane Denial, Counterspell, and Negate, all of which provide cheap spell disruption to help keep Obeka and our more powerful upkeep triggers alive for longer against spot removal and wipes, as well as Reverse the Polarity, which can again interfere with our opponent's casting, or, if we need to, we can instead use it to make our board unblockable to ensure Obeka can get in even if we have no other forms of evasion available. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Our sorcery category, much like our instance, is going to further pad our core stats with its 3 entrants, those being the ramping ritual rousing refrain, which we can suspend if drawn early and suspends itself every time we cast it to both generate us a solid amount of red mana and benefit from our extra upkeeps to cast itself again faster, the draw spell inspiring refrain, which has the same suspend benefits as the previous entry but instead provides repeatable card advantage to ensure our hands stay nice and full, and lastly, the Board Wipe Blasphemous Act, which functions as a staple way for us to cheaply retake control of the board if things start getting out of hand. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Reaching our enchantments, we'll start off by adding some additional sources of generic upkeep-centric entries to further fuel our primary game plan, slotting in as foretold as a way for us to progressively cast bigger and bigger spells at no mana cost, Phyrexian Arena as a cheap and reliable source of card advantage, provided we can survive the life loss, Descent into Avernus as a symmetrical source of treasure generation that also rapidly burns out the table to quickly close out games if we're ahead on life, Thopter Spy Network as part passive evasive token creation and part on attack draw as those tokens swing in to both build up our board and our hand, Mechanized Production as a way for us to make use of the various artifacts we'll be running to not only get extra copies of our most powerful ones, but also to turn the token copies it creates into an alternate win condition for us if we can stockpile them, and Palace Siege as generally a repeatable source of AoE life drain to help stabilize our life totals while reducing our opponents, though we can alternatively use it as a way to repeatedly recur our creatures from the bin if we need to. Then moving on to the arguably most powerful and definitely most expensive cards we'll be running in this build, we have Chord of Cunning, Chord of Ambition, Chord of Ire, and Chord of Embreth, all of which make us the Monarch on ETB for the extra card advantage, passively have on upkeep effects of their own that either mill, deal damage, or build up our board, and, if we have the Crown on our upkeep, supercharge their upkeep effects to the point that they can easily win the game for us on their own, either by milling out our opponents in the first case, or by the raw damage they can inflict onto our opponents in the case of the other 3. Though do keep in mind that they are very much overpriced at this point due to Obeka's existence, and their price may have increased even further even as I record this, so sorry in advance if that's the case. And then as the lone initiative focused entry we'll be adding to this category, we have Loot Dispute, which is a decent way for us to grab the initiative initially to begin exploring the Undercity, and it generates us a steady flow of treasures as we keep taking the initiative back with our evasive creatures, but really shines as yet another way for us to create massive evasive bodies to build up our board with as we speedrun through the dungeon each turn. And finally, as our last pair of enchantment entries, we'll be adding in the evasion-granting auras, Aqueous Form and Aether Tunnel, both of which are inexpensive, grant true evasion to Obeka to ensure she can always bypass blockers, and provide additional upside by either providing card selection as she cracks in, or by increasing her power by 1 so she can grant 3 upkeeps instead of 2 when she connects, not counting other power boosts. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. It's back to upkeep effects yet again as we enter our artifact category, which will see us add the trio of rings, Ring of Evos Isle, Ring of Zathrid, and Ring of Valkis, all of which passively load up Obeka with +1/+1 counters on each upkeep to exponentially grow her as she connects turn after turn, the first two also providing her with solid protection in the form of activatable Shroud and Regeneration respectively so she can stick around for longer, while the third instead provides her haste so she can swing in on the turn she comes down to begin generating us extra upkeeps immediately, along with the Mana Rock Replicating Ring, which is serviceable enough on its own as extra ramp and fixing, but becomes exceptional alongside Obeka, who significantly cuts the time it needs to multiply itself to net us even more ramp at a breakneck pace, potentially multiple times per game. Then, as our last upkeep-focused and initiative-focused card, we have Sarevok's Tome, which functions as a somewhat pricey mana rock that gets better when we have the initiative, which it grants us when it comes down, and later turns into a repeatable way for us to cast spells off the top of our deck each turn once we've cleared the dungeon, generally at a discount, to help keep our tempo up. Now, having covered our entire upkeep-focused arsenal, we can now focus our efforts onto suiting up Obeka with some equipment she can use to hit as hard and as often as possible to get the maximum usage out of her effect, while also staying alive in the process. As such, we'll be adding in Trailblazer's boots and Whispersilk cloak, both of which provide Obeka with fantastic evasion that will allow her to safely crack into almost any board, with the latter also providing solid targeted removal protection on top of that via Shroud, Winged Boots, which provides both serviceable evasion in the form of flying and protection in the form of Ward 4 for even more reliable damage dealing and resilience, Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, each of which provide Obeka with even more targeting protection and have the added benefit of granting her haste as well, so she can swing in as soon as she comes down instead of having to wait a full rotation to generate us extra upkeeps, Fire Shrieker, which grants Obeka double strike to get twice the damage and thereby twice the extra upkeeps out of her every time she connects, and lastly, Two-Handed Axe and Black Blade Reforged, each of which augment Obeka's damage output by either doubling her power as she swings in, or by simply building up her stats alongside our land base to get even more upkeeps out of her, with the former also providing one-time surprise double strike to catch out on wary opponents with. And we'll then be closing out our artifact category with a selection of ramp pieces to help speed up and fix our mana base. Those being the Mana Rock's Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, Izzet Signet, Rakdos Signet, Talisman of Creativity, Talisman of Dominance, and Talisman of Indulgence, along with the land ramp source Wayfarer's Bauble, all of which provide our 3-color build with cheap ramp and fixing so we can reliably cast our spells, as well as Sonic Screwdriver, which costs a bit more but makes up for it by providing on-demand evasion as well should we need it. That covers all our artifacts, and since we won't be running any planeswalkers in this build, let's jump straight into our land base. Quickly going over our mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower and Crumbling Necropolis as lands that tap for all our colors to help boost consistency, Exotic Orchard as a land that should generally give us access to most of our colors off our opponents for even more fixing, the check lands Dragon Skull Summit, Drowned Catacomb, and Sulphur Falls, the reveal lands Choked Estuary, Foreboding Ruins, and Frostboil Snarl, and the battle lands Smoldering Marsh and Sunken Hollow, all of which are duels that take advantage of our basics to come into play untapped to provide solid access to our colors without sacrificing speed, and finally, the filter lands Darkwater Catacombs, Ferris Lake, and Shadowblood Ridge as even more untapped duels to ensure we have even more quick and easy access to our colors. Then, for utility lands, we'll be running the evasion-granting Rogue's Passage and Access Tunnel, giving us one last way to ensure we can get Obeka in for damage for some added redundancy. And finally, we'll be running 7 islands, 7 swamps, and 6 mountains as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 20 generic upkeep effects, 5 cards that grant us the monarch and care about us being the monarch on our upkeep, as well as 6 cards that grant us the initiative and care about us having completed dungeons, to ensure we have plenty of upkeep triggers and payoffs that can take advantage of the additional upkeeps Obeka grants us, 4 sources of extra upkeeps to net us even more mileage out of those cards alongside our commander, 10 sources of evasion granting, 7 ways to increase Obeka's power, and 3 ways to grant her double strike to ensure she can get in for damage reliably and hit as hard as possible to grant us even more upkeeps, and lastly, 6 sources of targeting and or destruction protection to ensure she can stay alive for as long as possible to keep empowering all our upkeep triggers. For general deck stats, we have 17 ramp sources, 15 card draw sources, 8 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our ramp and draw being much higher than normal in this build, since we're rather committed to the monarch and to on upkeep draw sources, and need the mana to cast those spells before we start overdrawing, while our targeted removal is slightly below average, since we're more concerned about keeping Obeka alive with our protection sources so she can take over the game for us, rather than disrupting our opponents. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.27, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that wants us to set up our board initially with ramp sources and on upkeep effects while keeping our commander in reserve to mitigate our opponent's window of dealing with her before she can generate us value. Then, once we have ways to keep her alive in our hand or in play, we can commit her to the board, hopefully weathering the assault of removal that's sure to come her way, and then using our variety of evasion-granting sources to get her in for damage to supercharge all our upkeep triggers. Then from there, it's just a matter of getting Obeka in for damage as often as possible, ideally while also powering her up so she can grant us even more upkeeps, while we build up our board with more and more upkeep triggers to get extra usage out of, until our opponents simply cave under the insane amount of value, board presence, and damage we can generate. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.38, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we would like to side grade our deck in one direction or another without going over budget, we can consider swapping out Winged Boots for Starscream Power Hungry if we'd rather have less protection and evasion granting in order for us to add in more ways to get the Monarch into play and to turn all our card advantage into burn to help us close out games. Or, if we'd rather play a much higher risk game, we can instead trade out Thopter Spy Network and Mechanized Production in favor of Braid's Conjurer Adept and Wild Evocation, which net all players free spells on their upkeep, but will hopefully benefit us much more than our opponents considering just how many more upkeeps we can generate in comparison to them. Then, if we want to upgrade this build by going over budget, Laughing Jasper Flint can be replaced with Paradox Haze as a reasonable upgrade to passively grant us even more extra upkeeps on our turn, and then from there, we have our choice of overpriced cards whose price has primarily skyrocketed due to our commander's existence, in which we have the option to trade out Blackblade Reforged for Creeping Bloodsucker, which functions as a cheap source of AoE life drain that can suck the life out of our opponents and our wallets as a common. Mechanized Production and Thopter Spy Network can be swapped out for Court of Vantris and Court of Locthwain, which give us access to 2 more Monarch upkeep triggers to generate us even more value in-game while reducing our bank account's monetary value in real life, and Loot Dispute can be replaced with Extravagant Replication, which gives us more and more copies of our best permanents turn after turn at nearly 500% the price it was 3 months ago. Though personally, I would highly recommend holding on to our hard-earned cash instead and wait for reprints instead of paying for these overinflated prices. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the channel subscribers for having helped the channel reach its 19.7k subscriber milestone. We're inching ever closer to that coveted 20k milestone, and it's all thanks to your continued support. So sincerely, thank you. Now, with our Obeka build covered, the next commander we'll be tackling will be last week's poll winner, the uncompleted but still lethal Gorgon, Vraska the Silencer. So look forward to that build coming soon. Then moving on to this week's poll, we have a trio of commanders that you folks requested for specifically in the comments vying for your votes. Those being the alternate casting commander, Kellen the Kid, the all-in on modal spells Riku of Many Paths, and the legally distinct Paul Bunyan analog, Bonnie Paul Clearcutter. So be sure to cast your votes, link in the description, before the deadline on May 17th, and let me know in the comments which commander you voted for and which commanders from this set you'd like to see me feature in future polls. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Consider donating to buy me a coffee or use my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to support the channel directly. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the deck techs I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.